At 1:15 in the afternoon, Beijing time, on July 10, 2026, a rocket lifted off from a launch pad on Hainan Island in southern China, carrying a satellite toward orbit. That part, on its own, would barely make international news. Rockets launch somewhere in the world almost every week. But 6 minutes after this particular rocket's first and second stages separated, something happened that had never been done successfully by any country except the United States. The first stage booster, 150 feet of spent rocket hardware falling back toward the ocean, reignited its engines, slowed itself down, oriented itself perfectly upright, and descended directly into a massive net suspended above a floating platform at sea. Cameras on the platform captured the booster smoking slightly at the top as it settled gently into the net, intact, recoverable, and reusable. With that one landing, China became only the second nation on Earth to achieve controlled recovery of an orbital rocket's first stage, joining an exclusive club that, until that afternoon, had exactly one member. So how does a piece of hardware falling from the edge of space land itself in a net floating on the ocean? And why does this one landing matter so much more than it might first appear? Let's get into it.
To understand why this moment matters, you have to understand just how difficult reusable rocketry actually is, and why almost every space program on the planet has struggled to replicate what SpaceX built. A rocket's first stage is not a passive object falling out of the sky. During ascent, it burns through most of its fuel, accelerating a payload toward orbit. And once it separates from the upper stage, it is typically hundreds of kilometers away from its launch site, moving at several times the speed of sound, tumbling through the thin upper atmosphere. Bringing that stage back down safely means solving an enormous list of problems simultaneously. The booster has to survive intense heating as it re-enters denser air. It has to reignite engines that were only ever designed to fire once during a single continuous burn. It has to use tiny amounts of remaining fuel with extreme precision because there is no margin for a second attempt. And it has to hit an extremely small, often moving target, whether that is a landing pad, a drone ship, or in China's case, a net stretched over the deck of a platform bobbing on ocean swells. SpaceX spent close to a decade and multiple spectacular failures before Falcon 9 boosters started landing reliably. Blue Origin took years to land its New Glenn rocket successfully for the first time. Reusability sounds simple in a headline. In practice, it is one of the most demanding engineering problems in modern aerospace, which is exactly why so few programs have managed to pull it off.
The rocket at the center of this story is the Long March 10B, built by the China Academy of Launch Vehicle Technology, an arm of the state-owned China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. Standing about 63 meters tall, roughly the height of a 20-story building, the Long March 10B is a two-stage rocket designed specifically for the commercial launch market. Its first stage burns kerosene and liquid oxygen, a fairly conventional propellant combination, while its second stage uses a newer combination of liquid methane and liquid oxygen, a propellant mix increasingly favored by newer rocket designs because it burns cleaner and leaves less residue inside engine components, making repeated reuse easier over time. In its reusable configuration, the Long March 10B can carry about 16 tons of payload into low Earth orbit, putting it roughly in the same performance class as SpaceX's workhorse Falcon 9, although the Long March 10B is about 7 meters shorter. The rocket shares its first stage design with a related vehicle called the Long March 10A, which is being developed for China's crewed lunar missions, meaning the recovery technology proven on this commercial flight feeds directly into the hardware China plans to use to send astronauts toward the moon later this decade.
Here is where the Long March 10B genuinely does something nobody else has done before. Every existing reusable rocket in the world, SpaceX's Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy, and Blue Origin's New Glenn, lands the same basic way, using deployable landing legs that unfold just before touchdown, allowing the booster to settle down onto a solid pad or a drone ship under its own power. The Long March 10B skips landing legs entirely. Instead, engineers built a completely different recovery method, built around a wire-based capture system. As the booster performs its final approach, hook mechanisms mounted on its exterior deploy, designed to physically engage a system of tensioned cables strung across a large capture structure fixed to the deck of the recovery ship. 4 LiDAR units positioned around this structure continuously track the booster's exact position and orientation during its final seconds of descent, feeding that data to guide the vehicle into the capture zone with enormous precision. Once the hooks engage the net and cables, the system absorbs the remaining kinetic energy of the falling stage, first through auxiliary cables that stabilize the booster against the motion of ocean waves and wind, then through an automated locking platform that moves in beneath the rocket and clamps it firmly into place for transport back to shore. According to Chinese state media, this entire capture sequence runs automatically, without requiring any crew to be present inside the actual recovery zone during the catch.
It's worth sitting with 2 separate facts here, because they are easy to blur together, but they mean different things. First, China is now the second country on Earth, after the United States, to achieve a controlled recovery of an orbital-class rocket's first stage. That milestone alone puts China in a category that includes only itself and American companies, ahead of every space program in Europe, Russia, Japan, and elsewhere. Second, and separately, this was the world's first successful net-based recovery of a launch vehicle of any kind, by any country. Nobody, including SpaceX, has ever caught a returning orbital booster this way before. That distinction matters because it means China did not simply replicate an existing solution, it engineered an entirely different one, in a domain where copying a known working design would have already been the easier, safer, more conventional path. There is also a detail that deserves real credit on its own. This successful capture happened on the Long March 10B's very first flight ever, its maiden launch. SpaceX did not land Falcon 9 successfully until well after its debut. No other rocket from any country has achieved a clean, successful first-stage recovery on its inaugural mission before this.
This success looks even more significant when you place it next to what happened just months earlier. 2 other Chinese reusable rocket programs, the state-developed Long March 12A and the commercial Zhuke-3, built by the Beijing-based company Landspace, had each attempted their own orbital test flights within the previous year. Both rockets successfully reached orbit and delivered their payloads as planned. Neither one managed to land its first stage successfully. Those 2 very public, very recent failures set up a genuine, uncertain moment for the Long March 10B's own debut. There was no guarantee this attempt would work either, and Chinese state media had been notably tight-lipped about the specifics of the recovery plan beforehand, a pattern common when the outcome of a high-profile test is genuinely uncertain. When the Long March 10B's booster came down cleanly into the net on its very first attempt, it did so against a recent backdrop of 2 other serious Chinese engineering teams trying the same basic feat and falling short. That context is part of why aerospace analysts around the world reacted to this landing with more than routine interest.
The obvious question after any technical milestone like this is simple. Does it actually matter beyond the achievement itself? In this case, the answer is yes, and it comes down to economics. Every time a rocket's first stage is thrown away after a single use, whatever it costs to build, often the majority of a rocket's total manufacturing cost, is destroyed along with it. Reusability is exactly what allowed SpaceX to dramatically lower the price of reaching orbit over the past decade, eventually dominating the global commercial launch market almost entirely on the strength of that one capability. China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation directly acknowledged this dynamic in its own statement following the launch, describing the Long March 10B's reusable configuration as significantly reducing launch costs while offering large payload capacity and high cost effectiveness. Lower launch costs do not just make individual missions cheaper, they change what becomes economically possible in the first place, from deploying much larger satellite internet constellations to supporting a growing commercial space station economy, to eventually making crewed lunar missions something that happens on a repeatable, sustainable basis, rather than as a rare, enormously expensive one-off event.
It's important to be precise about exactly what has and has not been proven at this stage, because a single successful landing, however impressive, is not the same thing as a fully operational reusable rocket. There are three distinct milestones that separate a genuine reusability program from a one-time technical demonstration. The first is controlled recovery, meaning the booster returns intact and reaches its intended recovery system without being destroyed. China has now clearly achieved that. The second is reflight, meaning engineers inspect that exact same booster, complete whatever refurbishment work is required, and successfully launch it again. According to CASC's own statement, the company plans to reuse this specific recovered booster in another flight later this year, which will be the real next test of whether the vehicle survived its ocean capture in good enough condition to fly again. The third and final milestone is genuine operational reuse, meaning boosters fly repeatedly, reliably, on predictable schedules, with maintenance costs and turnaround times low enough to actually beat the cost of simply building a new first stage for every single mission. China has completed the first of these three steps. The next 12 months, centered on that promised reflight, will show whether the second step holds up under real conditions.
Beyond the commercial satellite market this rocket was built to serve, the technology being proven here connects to some of China's biggest space ambitions. The Long March 10B shares its first stage with the Long March 10A, the rocket family specifically being developed to carry Chinese astronauts to the moon later this decade as part of the country's crewed lunar landing program. Every piece of recovery data collected from this mission, every measurement of how the booster behaved during descent, capture, and the ocean landing itself feeds directly into refining that closely related lunar vehicle. There is also a broader strategic dimension. Reusable rockets are increasingly viewed not just as a commercial convenience, but as critical national infrastructure, since the same launch capability needed to deploy civilian satellite constellations is also relevant to placing military and reconnaissance satellites into orbit quickly and affordably. As space becomes an increasingly contested and economically important domain, a nation's ability to reach orbit cheaply, reliably, and repeatedly has become a meaningful measure of overall technological and strategic capability, not just a matter of scientific prestige.
Zoom out far enough, and this single net capture landing fits into a much larger pattern that has defined a lot of China's technology headlines throughout 2026, finding a different engineering path to reach the same destination as its rivals, rather than simply copying the existing solution. Where SpaceX and Blue Origin use landing legs and vertical touchdowns, refined over years of iteration, China built an entirely separate net-based capture method and made it work on the very first attempt. That pattern, arriving at a competitive outcome through an unconventional route, is becoming something of a signature in how Chinese engineering teams are approaching several different frontier technology races at once, from chip architecture to fusion energy to now reusable rockets. Whether the net capture method ultimately proves as reliable and cost-effective as booster legs over the long run is still an open question that will only be answered by the coming reflight attempts. But the successful debut alone has already reshaped how seriously international space agencies and private launch companies are tracking China's reusable rocket programs, precisely because betting against this kind of engineering creativity has become a noticeably riskier assumption than it used to be. So here's the real question worth sitting with. For the better part of a decade, SpaceX effectively had the reusable rocket market almost entirely to itself, and that scarcity was a major part of why it came to dominate global commercial spaceflight so completely. What happens to that market, and to the price of reaching orbit worldwide, once a second major power has genuinely mastered rocket recovery too, using a method nobody else has even attempted? Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you want more grounded breakdowns of the real engineering breakthroughs reshaping the global space race, subscribe, because China's next reusable rocket test is already scheduled before the end of this year.